Become the person you're afraid to be. The insane philosophy of Feynman: most people don't fail. They never even try. Not because they lack talent or opportunity, but because they've built an identity designed to protect them from the truth. You tell yourself stories about who you are, stories that sound reasonable, that make sense to others, that keep you safe. You're the person who works hard but never quite reaches their potential. The person who's smart but just needs the right opportunity. The person who would do great things if only circumstances were different. These stories aren't lies exactly. They're something worse. They're comfortable half-truths that let you avoid the most terrifying question you'll ever face. What if you stopped hiding? What if you became the person you're actually capable of being? But somewhere beneath those stories, beneath the performance you call your life, there's a version of yourself you're terrified to become. Someone who thinks alone. Someone who admits ignorance in public. Someone who disappoints the people who believe in you. Someone who questions authorities everyone else respects. Someone who lives without the comfort of certainty, without the safety of belonging, without the protection of a carefully constructed identity. Richard Feynman understood this at 20 years old. He looked at his own reflection, not in a mirror, but in the terrified faces of people who realized he wasn't going to play the game, and saw not a genius, but a person willing to stop lying to himself. That choice destroyed him. It cost him friends, comfort, the easy path to success, and it set him free in ways most people will never understand. If this idea feels like something you already knew, but were afraid to admit, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel to keep exploring what it means to think honestly. Like the video if it made you uncomfortable. That's how you know it's real. And leave a comment telling me what mask you're wearing. I read every single one. Feynman grew up in a small house in Far Rockaway, Queens, where his father taught him the most dangerous lesson a child can learn. Words don't mean anything if you don't understand what's actually happening. His father worked as a sales manager for a uniform company, not a professor, not a scientist, just a man who understood that most people confuse naming things with understanding them. He would take young Richard to museums on weekends, point at birds in exhibits, and say, "You can know the name of that bird in every language in the world. You can know it's called a brown-throated thrush in English, a pfeiffer in German, a chungling in Chinese, and when you're finished, you'll know absolutely nothing about the bird. You'll only know what humans in different places call it. But if you want to understand the bird, you have to watch what it does." Most parents teach their children to memorize, to collect facts, to know the answers teachers want to hear. Feynman's father taught him to question. That sounds beautiful in the abstract. This image of a curious child encouraged to explore. But think about what it actually costs. When you learn to think for yourself, you stop belonging to the tribe. You can't just accept what authority figures tell you. You can't nod along when everyone else agrees. You can't pretend to understand things because understanding them is socially expected. You become intellectually orphaned. Feynman spent his entire childhood asking questions no one else cared about, not because he was smarter, but because he refused to pretend he understood things he didn't. While his classmates learned multiplication tables and state capitals and all the things you're supposed to know, Feynman was asking why numbers work the way they do, what math actually means, whether 2 + 2 = 4 because of something real or just because we all agreed it does. His classmates learned to fit in. He learned to be alone, and that's the first price of intellectual honesty, isolation. Because when you refuse to accept comfortable lies, you discover how much of human connection is built on shared delusions. By the time he arrived at MIT in 1935, Feynman had already developed the habit that would define his life. He couldn't pretend. Not wouldn't, couldn't. It wasn't a moral choice. It was a psychological impossibility. Other students performed intelligence. They used big words in conversations, quoted authorities they'd barely read, adopted the mannerisms of serious scholars. They wore suits to class, spoke in measured tones, framed their ideas with appropriate hesitation and deference. They were learning to be academics, which meant learning to signal intelligence without necessarily having to demonstrate it. Feynman showed up in a t-shirt, played bongos in his dorm room at 2 in the morning, told jokes during lectures, solved problems in ways that made professors uncomfortable because they couldn't follow his reasoning. He'd raise his hand in quantum mechanics and say, "I don't understand what you just said," when everyone else was nodding along, pretending they did. He'd challenge assumptions that had been accepted for decades, not because he wanted to show off, but because the assumptions didn't make sense and he couldn't pretend they did. People thought he was arrogant, that he was showing off, that he was trying to humiliate his professors or prove he was smarter than everyone else. He wasn't. He was terrified, because when you refuse to wear a mask, you're forced to live with whatever's underneath. And what if there's nothing there? What if you strip away the performance and discover you're not actually as smart as you need to be? What if your real self, the one you've been hiding, turns out to be ordinary, confused, inadequate? Most people can't live with that level of uncertainty. They'd rather perform confidence than risk discovering they're ordinary. Feynman couldn't make that trade, so he walked around MIT like someone without skin. Everything raw, everything visible, everything real, and it made people deeply uncomfortable because authenticity is aggressive. When you refuse to play social games, you force everyone else to acknowledge they're playing them. When you won't pretend, you make other people's pretending visible, and they hate you for it. Then came Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project, 1943. Feynman was 25 years old, recruited straight from Princeton, suddenly surrounded by the greatest minds in theoretical physics, Oppenheimer, Bethe, Teller, Fermi, working on a weapon that would kill hundreds of thousands of people. The youngest scientists in the world, building the most destructive force humans had ever conceived. And while Feynman worked on the bomb, calculating blast radiuses and neutron diffusion rates and critical mass equations, his wife Arlene was dying of tuberculosis in a hospital in Albuquerque, 2 hours away across the New Mexico desert. He would visit her on weekends, drive through empty desert highways, walk into that hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and death, hold her hand, pretend everything was fine. He was 25 years old. They'd been married less than 2 years. He couldn't breathe without coughing blood. And there was nothing he could do. No equation could fix it. No amount of intelligence could stop it. So he would sit with her, tell her jokes, talk about nothing important, and then drive back to Los Alamos and calculate blast radiuses for a weapon designed to incinerate cities. People later asked him how he did it, how he kept working while she was dying. They wanted him to say something profound, to explain the psychological mechanism that let him compartmentalize. He said he didn't know. He said he just kept going, because stopping didn't make sense either. And that's the truth no one wants to hear. What happened at Los Alamos wasn't heroism. It was the collapse of meaning. Feynman discovered that life doesn't stop for tragedy. The universe doesn't pause while you grieve. The equations don't care that your wife is dying in a hospital 2 hours away. The work continues. The calculations demand completion. And you can either accept that brutal indifference or spend your life pretending there's some deeper order, some hidden justice, some cosmic plan that makes suffering meaningful. Feynman chose acceptance, not because it felt good, because lying felt worse. After the war, after Arlene died, Feynman did something strange. He started breaking into locked filing cabinets at Los Alamos, not for espionage, not for secrets, just because he could. He figured out how the combination locks worked, practiced for hours, and would leave notes inside classified documents. Borrowed your file. Feynman. Security officers were furious. Oppenheimer thought it was hilarious. But here's what matters. While everyone else was performing seriousness, wearing their importance like armor, treating security protocols like sacred rituals, Feynman was exposing the absurdity. The locks everyone trusted, trivial. The systems everyone respected, theater. He wasn't being childish. He was demonstrating that most of what we call security is just shared pretending. And if you're willing to actually look at how things work instead of accepting what you're told, the illusions collapse. Stop for a second. Where are you doing this? Where are you treating rituals like they're real? You go to meetings that accomplish nothing, but everyone pretends they're essential. You maintain relationships that died years ago, but no one admits it. You pursue goals you don't actually want because everyone says you should. You're living in a locked filing cabinet, and the combination is obvious, but you won't try it because everyone else is pretending the lock works. Feynman spent his entire life opening locks other people were too afraid to touch. After the war, surrounded by brilliant scientists, Feynman started noticing something disturbing. Most of them weren't actually doing science. They were performing science. They used the right terminology, followed the correct procedures, published papers in respected journals. They had hypotheses and control groups and statistical analyses. Everything looked right. Everything sounded legitimate. But they weren't thinking. They weren't asking real questions. They were going through motions whose meaning they'd forgotten. Feynman called it cargo cult science. During World War II, islands in the South Pacific became military bases. The indigenous people watched planes land, saw soldiers unload cargo, food, equipment, medicine, and after the war ended, they built fake runways out of bamboo. They carved wooden headphones. They stood in control towers made of straw, waving landing signals at empty skies. They had the form, but not the function. And here's the terrifying part. Most of them didn't even know it. They believed their own performance. You have the relationship that looks right from the outside, the partner, the routines, the shared plans. But is there anything actually alive underneath? You have the career that signals success, the title, the salary, the respect. But are you doing work that matters or just work that looks like it should matter? You're building bamboo runways and wondering why nothing real ever lands. Feynman became famous for 3 words: I don't know. In interviews, lectures, conversations, whenever someone asked him something he didn't understand, he said it plainly. No hedging, no intellectual posturing, no, that's an interesting question, or, well, it depends on how you define, just honesty. I don't know. And people hated it. Interviewers would ask him to explain the meaning of quantum mechanics or the purpose of scientific inquiry, and he'd say, I don't know what you mean by meaning. I can tell you how it works, but I don't know why it works that way. Nobody does. Because I don't know is the most dangerous sentence in the English language. It's not humble. It's terrifying. When you admit you don't know, you lose the identity you've built around seeming intelligent. You lose the comfort of certainty. You lose the protection that comes from always having an answer. You lose the social safety that comes from appearing competent, informed, authoritative. And most people would rather lie, not consciously, but through vague language, confident tone, borrowed expertise, than face that emptiness. They'd rather say something that sounds smart than admit they don't actually understand. They'd rather maintain the illusion of knowledge than experience the freedom of honest ignorance. Feynman chose the emptiness because he understood something most people never learn. I don't know isn't a confession of weakness. It's a refusal to bullshit yourself. And that refusal is the only real freedom you'll ever have. When you stop pretending to know things you don't, you stop being afraid of being exposed. You stop defending positions you never really believed. You stop carrying the exhausting weight of a fake intellectual identity. You become free to actually learn, free to be curious, free to change your mind, free to be wrong. And that freedom, the freedom to exist without pretense, is worth more than any reputation you could ever build. Then came the moment that defined everything. January 28, 1986. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 73 seconds after launch. 7 people died on live television. The nation watched it happen. NASA convened an investigation, a presidential commission. Feynman was asked to join. He was 67 years old, dying of cancer, exhausted. He didn't want to go, but he went. And what he found was institutional cowardice disguised as engineering. The investigation was supposed to take months. Formal hearings, careful deliberation, political considerations. NASA executives testified. Engineers presented data. Everyone used the right language. Everyone followed procedure. Everyone performed due diligence. And no one told the truth. Feynman sat in those hearings watching people dance around what they all knew: the O-rings, the cold temperature, the warnings that had been ignored for years. NASA engineers had told their superiors the O-rings would fail below freezing. They'd put it in writing, and their superiors had launched anyway. Because schedules mattered more than safety. Because looking competent mattered more than being honest. Because admitting the problem meant admitting they'd been launching unsafe shuttles for years. Feynman couldn't sit through one more day of it. On February 11th, during a televised hearing, he asked for a glass of ice water. The room went quiet. He pulled an O-ring from his pocket, the same rubber seal that had failed on Challenger. He clamped it with a simple clamp. He dropped it into the ice water, and then he just sat there, didn't explain, didn't lecture, just waited. After a few minutes, he pulled it out, pressed it with his fingers, showed everyone watching that the rubber had lost its flexibility. It was a fourth-grade science demonstration. A child could have understood it, and it destroyed NASA's credibility in 30 seconds. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. NASA officials went pale. Because Feynman had done what no one else was willing to do, he'd made the truth visible. Not in a technical report, not in a closed-door meeting, on national television, in a way anyone could understand. He didn't do it to be a hero. He did it because lying made him sick. But here's what that cost him. The commission members were furious. NASA officials stopped talking to him. Political allies called him reckless. He'd broken the unspoken rule. You don't embarrass powerful institutions publicly. You don't make everyone look complicit. You don't force everyone to acknowledge what they've been pretending not to see. That's the price of honesty. You don't get to be right and liked. You have to choose. Feynman chose truth. And he sat alone at that table while everyone else figured out how to protect their reputations. What are you protecting? What truth are you avoiding because saying it out loud would cost you something? What O-ring are you pretending still works? After Challenger, Feynman refused the National Medal of Science, turned down honorary degrees, avoided award ceremonies. People thought he was being modest. He wasn't. He was protecting himself from becoming someone he didn't recognize. Because every time you accept an award, you accept the identity that comes with it. You become the award-winning scientist, the distinguished professor, the celebrated genius. And once you accept that identity, you have to defend it. You have to keep being that person. Feynman understood that those identities were traps, beautiful, prestigious, socially rewarded traps, but traps nonetheless. He saw colleagues spend decades protecting reputations instead of doing work. He watched brilliant people become prisoners of their own success. So he said no. Not because he didn't care about recognition, because he cared more about remaining free. Feynman didn't need the universe to make sense. He didn't need life to have a purpose. He was fine with mystery, with ambiguity, with not knowing why anything exists or what happens when you die, or whether any of this matters. Most people can't live like that. They need answers. They need to believe there's a reason for suffering, a plan behind chaos, a meaning waiting to be discovered. And when they can't find it, they invent it. Feynman did the opposite. He accepted that he didn't know, and he found that acceptance more beautiful than any answer could ever be. Feynman died of cancer in February 1988. He was 69 years old. His last words were, "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." Even at the end, he refused to dramatize it, refused to make death mean something it didn't. He just died, and that was enough. Because his life wasn't about building a legacy or being remembered or mattering in some cosmic sense. It was about living honestly, about thinking clearly, about refusing to lie to himself even when lying would have been easier. He became the person he was afraid to be, the person who thought alone, who admitted ignorance, who disappointed expectations, who lived without guarantees. And in doing that, he found the only freedom that matters, the freedom to be real. You don't have to be brilliant to do what Feynman did. You just have to be honest. You have to stop performing and start living. You have to become the person you're afraid to be. Feynman became who he feared being. And you? You're still deciding.